Hey guys, I'm trying to finally get part 3 of this together. I'm sorry it's taken me a really long time to get through to this video. Part of that has been kind of holding off, hoping that things would start looking considerably better than what I'd foreseen before, which is unfortunately not really the case. I'll get into why on that in a second, especially since, again, I'm at odds with a lot of our national media that really does seem to think that we've dodged some sort of bullet here, where I do think that we have very encouraging signs, but at best we've paused or slowed the bullet. Dodging is not something that's going to be possible until a vaccine arrives. And that's going to take us a considerable amount of time. So, yeah, I'm going to try not to be too depressing here. I've tried this video a few times and it always does come out quite depressing. There are definitely optimistic and hopeful signs, but we are still definitely in a mess. So this will likely again become a long video. I'm going to try putting timestamps down in the bottom. What I intend to go over in this is just a quick recap of the previous two parts, followed by a look at both the John Hopkins data site as well as the Worldometer data site. Those are the two areas that I use for world numbers as well as local numbers. Then we will look a little more closely at Canada's situation as it currently stands, as well as a quick look through the Wayback Machine. It's an internet archive that will allow us to take a look at kind of the arc of how this first wave of pandemic seems to go through countries. So we'll kind of use Italy as a bit of a case study on that. So, yeah, I guess we'll just start with the recap here. Again, I will put descriptions and links and timestamps and links and stuff like that in the description below. So, we started off by looking at the idea that the virus doesn't spread, that people spread the virus. So that remains very important, that the virus is never going to be able to move on it. We're the ones taking it around, and if we recognize that, we can reduce the chances of us taking it around. So it's time to stop thinking of it as an enemy. It's not something that we're running and hiding from, and it's not chasing us. More to think of it as a burr. It's something that's clinging to us, and we're carrying it around and bringing it from place to place so it can grow new plants. Asymptomatic spreading is a thing, and it's the biggest part of the problem, and it remains the biggest part of the problem. I've been very happy to see that in the Western world, in Canada in particular, there has been a bit of a change on the viewpoint of face masks. Unfortunately, because we did have previous messaging saying that face masks were not to be used by the public, it's taking a long time to now get them adopted by the public. They are definitely not the sole answer to this problem, but they are definitely going to help a lot with the asymptomatic spread. And that will help a lot in the long run towards figuring out a new normal that will allow us to have a functional economy. Because right now, jumping into it without the basic things like face masks is really going to blow up in our faces. But hopefully we won't jump in too quickly, and I do think that the next week, definitely 2 weeks, is going to be a bit of a wake-up call for Canada and for a lot of the rest of the states. We're not at war with the virus, we're at war with our own impulses. That's more true now than ever because we do have kind of this collective feeling that, okay, we've flattened the curve, we've dodged the bullet, we can go back to normal now. And people are still asking when we can go back to normal. And the answer to that is quite simple. When there's a functional virus, or sorry, not virus, there's definitely a functional virus. When there's a functional vaccine, not a functional treatment, when there's a functional vaccine. A functional treatment very helpful, and that will be helpful. And we do have some leads there. So I'll do another dealing with some of the hopeful signs that we have, because there are some definite signs. A few confusing that does the virus connect to other ACEs in the body. There's been some information that's come out both from autopsies as well as from studies of both the European front as well as the Asian front on what has happened with recovered and deceased people, what's happened to their systems. So I will pull together a video with that will have some links and information that you guys can look into. So we need to get the R naught below 1. I've done 2 videos on R naught itself, and it was also part of part 2 of this particular series. So please look at any of those 3 or all of those 3 sources for an explanation on what R naught is if you're not familiar. But if we can drive it below 1, which can definitely be done, countries are doing it. Look at New Zealand, look at the Czech Republic. They're managing to functionally run it below 1 quite well, and so have most of the Asian countries, although Singapore is starting to show some numbers now. But Singapore, South Korea, Taiwan, Hong Kong, all of them have done quite well at keeping it at 1 or below. And there's 3 ways that we can get R naught below 1. There's the herd immunity route, which we are all desperately trying to avoid using social distancing, lockdowns, and all of those fun little measures. So that's the natural herd immunity route, which would be the virus making its way through the population and giving us immunity by first infecting us, and we go through the disease and we build up antibodies and so on and so forth. The next one would be through a vaccine. That's the artificial herd immunity route, where we create artificial immunity by in the body to create antibodies using a safe. And the third option would be one that would kind of be forced in for various reasons. Also, by far the most difficult will be transmission, and that's basically the track down every case of this virus, and we make sure that that case cannot transmit to a new susceptible person, and therefore break the links of that transmission chain. If we can break the links of all the transmission chains, then we can actually kill the virus overall. We can wipe it out so it doesn't continue coming back and become an endemic disease. Because this, as an endemic disease, would be uncomfortable. Like, even if we get a vaccine, there's no guarantee that a vaccine is going to give us long-term immunity. This is a coronavirus. I think the best we have right now is like MERS, that has a 3-year window for functional antibodies. That's if you get the disease, survive the disease, your body builds antibodies. They will protect you for about a 3-year window before you're susceptible to getting the disease again. 3-year window seems like a long time, but it's not really. So we've got to look into all of these things, because there's a lot of questions about just how functional the antibodies are insofar as fighting off another infection. So just before we get into other things, let's look at a couple quick things. I know the WHO is in a lot of hot water right now, and apparently have lost some funding right now. So I'm not saying that we should listen to everything they say. They have been a little bit slow in the beginning of this particular pandemic. They, again, are likely doing the best that they can, but they're a political organization like any other, and politics is an uncomfortable place at times. Anyways, what they have lately said is that antibody tests measure the presence of your antibodies, but that doesn't mean that having antibodies will make someone immune. We haven't exactly got a bunch of people that have got through this disease and talked them into trying to get it again. We've done some animal model studies which do look promising, but those are again animal model studies. We have instances like South Korea, where we're now at 163 patients who have tested positive again after a full recovery. Now, this does appear to be some sort of reactivation of the virus and does not appear to, as far as this article is saying anyways, do much by the way of symptoms, that they're mild symptoms in at least 61 out of that 163. But it does indicate that the antibody levels in those patients are insufficient to keep the virus knocked down for any period of time. These tests were done an average of 13.5 days, so 2 weeks after recovery, some of them as long as a month after recovery. So we have to look into this information. A lot of this is just coming out recently. There's been some studies that came out from, I think it was Shanghai University, looking at antibody loads in different patients who had recovered, that there's a wide range. Some patients showing very high antibody loads, which would tend to indicate a very high level of immunity to reinfection. Some other patients with antibody loads so low as to be indetectable by the tests that they were using. So this is a developing situation that will definitely have to be looked into, because if the antibodies provide immunity, or if they provide enough immunity and is able to be detectable again, like here, Korean health authorities have basically changed so that they're now advising patients who recover to stay home for an additional 2 weeks and monitor for symptoms, just in case they are again still able to spread the disease and infect others after they've recovered. And that would definitely extend the self-isolation times that we're using here in the West right now. And would have some pretty serious consequences insofar as if people were sent back to jobs early, especially depending on what that job happens to be. Alright, so that was a little side note that I wasn't planning on doing, but again, timestamps below, so you guys have probably already skipped that. Here's the Johns Hopkins data. And this is a site that I think is a little more pretty than functional, we'll put it that way. I do look at it from time to time. I'm just going to refresh it now, because technically it is the official data, quote unquote. But it doesn't give as many functional options or as easily accessible data as Worldometer does. So we're going to switch to it in a second. I just first want to see what the updated numbers are for Johns Hopkins, because I do want to note that Worldometer tends to be a little bit ahead in its count. Now, I do believe that that's because Worldometer is going straight from news articles and just taking one source, whereas Johns Hopkins, I think, is also tracking local news in different jurisdictions, but is requiring multiple sources before they add it to their official numbers. Lots of people are looking at the official numbers today. This will take a second at times. My old angry laptop is not helping the process either. But partially this is a reason that I'm not a huge fan of the Johns Hopkins site. I'm not sure who owns this particular framework that they're using, but it's becoming very popular with all kinds of different countries, including Canada's. Official numbers are now displayed in this manner, and it's driving me kind of nuts. So basically 2.25 million. We're jumping up fast, aren't we? It was just yesterday, day before, that we were at 2 million. So they do have various different breakdowns. For some reason, they have decided to separate the U.S. out by state while leaving countries as countries in the same list. There's some very odd things that go on with some of these lists, but I invite you to take a look around, because again, these are the official numbers that a lot of organizations are using. This is the Worldometer site. This one I do find to be a lot more informative, or at least at a glance, less movement through it that you need. So overall world total deaths, overall world total recovered. And then they break it down to active cases. These are closed cases. This ratio can be pretty frightening at first. It's gone through some changes. If we look at it over time, this is the beginning of the outbreak out in Wuhan. It dropped down severely till somewhere around March 7th to 9th, somewhere in that area. Then starts going back up again. Now, my theory on this is the growth again, is that this is all the outbreak in Wuhan. And had no further outbreaks happened, this would have stayed here and probably gone a little lower, down to maybe 2%, 1%, maybe less if we're lucky. However, roughly around this time is when Italy's outbreak started, Iran's outbreak started, shortly followed by Spain and France, shortly followed by the UK, shortly followed by the US. And this is basically now becoming the world curve. So this will eventually start to go down as all of these active cases work through the system. But we're now back at a point on the world's curve where the bulk of the cases are still active and haven't had a chance to either recover or unfortunately pass away. So this will get better over time, but for the moment, as countries kind of cascade one after the other into their boom phases, this will remain high until these cases can start to work through and make this a larger number. We'll see that a little bit in the wayback machine data later. They do give us some nice graphs. I love that they give us logarithmic options. So in part 1 of this particular video series, I did talk a little bit about the logarithmic graph. Here we have the linear graph where everything's stepping up at 500,000 increments. If we move over to logarithmic, it's now stepping up by an order of magnitude. So we're adding a 0 each time, from 100 to 1,000 to 10,000, so on and so forth. What the logarithmic graphs allow us to do is look at a growth rate, an exponential growth rate, in something that's a little easier than these crazy curves that just shoot up to the sky. Anytime we have a straight line applied, it gives us a exponential growth trend. So we still do have exponential growth, because this line can be extended out on what's still uncomfortably close to a 45-degree line. But it's definitely a slower growth rate than we were experiencing between our 100,000 to 1 million point. If we had stayed on that particular growth rate curve as a planet, we would be blasting up to 10 million in the same period of time that it took us to move from 100,000 to 1 million. They give us a logarithmic option on deaths as well. I'm very happy to see the beginnings of a change in this curve, because this curve changing could simply be due to a lack of testing and an outpacing of new cases with the testing capability around the world. This number is more likely to be showing an actual change in the trend. I can't guarantee that all countries are reporting all of their deaths. However, I would tend to think that on the whole, worldwide, the deaths are being reported more accurately than the cases, because there's asymptomatic spread with this disease, as well as a delay in cases being filtered through to official channels. There's a large number of cases worldwide in basically every country that are not accounted for right now. Deaths, however, are much more likely to be accounted properly, so that's a better curve to be watching in a lot of instances. Likewise, it's a better number on the whole to be watching because, again, I'll use Canada as an example. Here in Ontario, where I am, we're only testing people who have obvious symptoms or are in high-risk groups. Those groups constantly change, so right now we're testing all of the patients and staff at long-term care homes. That's one of the very high-risk groups that we have. I believe health workers are still being tested, first responders are still being tested, people with obvious symptoms are being tested. Some rural populations are being tested. So again, as the testing it becomes available and the capacity ramps up, we're widening the net for what we're testing. But we're still at 13,000 per 1 million population, which ends up becoming 1.3%. I believe that at the moment, I think it's Alberta that's doing the best in Canada at 2.2% of the population being tested. Now, these, again, are antigen tests, not antibody tests, so they're only accurate if someone is sick at the time. It doesn't tell us anyone who's recovered from a previous infection. Antibody tests will do so, and those are starting to come online very quickly. But testing is something that is going to be a slow slog to do, although we absolutely need to do it. The more testing we have, the more clear a picture we have. And if we want to do that transmission extinction route, we have to know where every single infection is, so that we can be certain that they can't infect anyone else, and we can actually wipe this out. Yeah. So other things to look at here on the Worldometer site, because they really do give us some useful data. We've got our total cases, new cases in a 24-hour period. Now they reset technically after midnight, Greenwich Meridian time. Yes, that's what it is, or UTC, like I tend to think of it. That doesn't always happen right then. I do find sometimes it's slightly before, sometimes it's slightly after. Not entirely sure how all that works. But this column and this column are roughly a 24-hour period. Right now, the changeover happened just a couple hours ago, so we'll get, I think this will probably be California, maybe Washington is the one that reports late, and it ends up coming in as first thing for the next day. Brazil, so we'll get some countries that are reporting just after the line for the cutoff for Worldometers, but they do give you the wonderful option of being able to click on yesterday. You'll see that the numbers for yesterday in the US were again massive. You'll also see that yesterday China dropped some large numbers. Now, if you haven't found the news articles explaining this, this is a reworking of the original Wuhan data. So these are not new deaths that happened yesterday. These are deaths that happened during the original Wuhan outbreak, and the data has been reworked in whatever way, and they have increased the death rate, the number of deaths in the original outbreak by 50%. Not entirely sure what's going on there. I'm sure there's lots of questions going on there. I'm sure it will eventually come out what's going on. But for the time being, let's look on to what else we've got. So total recovered. These are our active cases. By comparing our active cases to our total cases, it gives us a good idea of where we are in the first wave. So the US is very early in its first wave because the massive bulk of its cases are active. Canada kind of looks like it's moving through its first wave because we've got 2/3 of our cases still active. We've managed to move through about 10,000 recoveries, which is good. Canada also has a lower testing rate than the States right now. Well, actually, no, sorry, that's not true. A lower testing number. The States has done 3 million, we've done about 500,000. However, if you look at testing rate, so per capita, the US has just now tested 1% of its population, 10,000 per 1 million in population, and Canada's at 1.3. So we're in the same rough ballpark figure. Like here at 20,000, that means Italy's at 2% of its population that's been tested. The other thing that's worth noting is, sorry, not the deaths per 1 million population, that one's uncomfortable, but the total cases per 1 million population. When we talk about herd immunity requiring 70 to 80% of the population, that would mean that this number here, that for the US is right now in the 2,000 range, would have to be showing 700,000 to 800,000. That would be 70 to 80% of 1 million. So we have a very long way to go before we reach herd immunity if we're going to be doing it naturally or artificially. If we're to vaccinate a large part of the world population or the large part of any country's population, that requires a lot of manufacturing and production and shipping of those vaccines, all of which requires time. So when we're looking at that 18-month window, that may or may not include the delays required in getting those products out to the places that they need to be. Other things that we need to keep in mind. Okay. So where are we at? Canada has now hit, I think this is day 4, over 100 deaths per day. We are continuing to ramp up in our new cases. Now, you will hear from most public health officials that we are slowing in our new cases. Now, that is kind of correct. There's a bunch of nuances that get lost in a lot of the public discussion. We are slowing in the rate of acceleration of new cases. That is definitely correct, and that's what we mean by we're flattening the curve. We're slowing down how quickly new cases seem to appear. It's not that we're slowing down how many new cases we're getting each day, and we can look at that briefly here. This is something called the Wayback Machine. I've pre-opened a bunch of tabs here, but for anyone who hasn't used it, you go to web.archive.org, you type in whatever site you're interested in. In this case, it's Worldometers, the coronavirus information. It's only existed since January 29th, so that's the first snapshot of it that they have, and we'll actually look at that one a little later in this video. But they take snapshots of the site throughout the day. This is the whole list of this, but as this starts getting more popular, wake up, Mr. Computer. It will start giving us longer and longer lists of snapshots if it ever connects over to the Wayback Machine. Anyways, we can go back in time using this. So it's the 17th now. This is going back to the 16th, so that's actually the data that we were just looking at here because we were looking at yesterday's data. No, that's incorrect. This is yesterday's data in the sense of the 17th, because today, according to Worldometers, we're already at the 18th, which will be in the real world in 1 minute. So this is actually showing the 16th data. So the 17th we had 115. Why am I showing only 18 here. I know that is incorrect. Oh, because of the image time that I'm looking at. Let's try looking at an image time from yesterday, which will allow us to take a look over. But yes, this is what I was talking about with image time, that I try to grab an image that's as close to the reset as possible, giving us as come on, we can do this, giving us as full a picture as possible. But if I grab something that's early on the 17th, we'll be able to move it back to its yesterday whenever that button hops up. Okay, so Canada was showing 181, and then its yesterday drops us down to 107. So I believe that's actually going to be the 15th, because if we do the same thing here, where this is showing 107, and it's yesterday. Okay, so this is where this one was showing 38. If we move to its yesterday, that should be the one, 107. So that would be the 15th, yes? Yes, so the 14th, we had 118. We have to go back to the 13th before we had less than 100. So 14th, 15th, 16th, and 17th. 16th, and we were looking at the 17th here. That, if we go back to the now, gives us the 181. And then just today, we had 115. So that's up to the 17th from the 14th, 15th, 16th, 17th. 4 days above 100 now, and we will see how long that trend continues. I do think that it might be the beginning of the boom phase for both Ontario and Quebec. Maybe not for BC. That might be that BC is a little bit behind us. That might be that BC has more successfully flattened the curve. I do think that that's actually possible. I don't think that it's necessarily due solely to the steps that BC Public Health has taken, although that has definitely been of benefit. BC Public Health does seem to be a little more integrated and connected in their chain of command than Ontario's or Quebec's seems to be. That seems to be a huge help. I also think that the Chinese immigrant population of BC has been a huge help in the sense that on the whole, most Asian countries have a lot more experience with respiratory diseases and take them a lot more seriously. I noticed that here in Ottawa as well, where we have a large Chinese immigrant community as well as a lot of Chinese students at our universities. And that way back in the end of February, there were already networks set up within the Chinese community to help one another through self-imposed isolation. And these were all people with no symptoms whatsoever, but because they were coming over from China, they immediately put themselves in 14 days isolation, got in touch with the rest of the community, and the community made sure that all the supplies required were brought to that person so they never had to leave. I would tend to assume that this happened as well in BC, and that would have drastically slowed down the original transmission chains. A lot of the transmission that we have in Quebec and Ontario, I would tend to assume, come largely from shopping interactions with the States, also with interactions with Europe. Europe had an earlier beginning to its community spread than Canada did. The US also had an earlier begin to its community spread than Canada did. And I think that the asymptomatic spread has really moved it throughout Ontario and Quebec in a way that it may not have in BC to the same degree yet. I do think that it's entirely possible that BC will go through a boom phase similar to what we're about to go through, but that could possibly be avoided as well. And a lot of this is very much up to how the public deals with the idea of self-isolation and whether the public pushes a little too quickly on the whole idea of getting out of the position that we're in now. Because the position that we're in now is the only thing that is slowing this down right now, and I don't think that that's fully sunk in with people. So, 1800 yesterday. Let's go back to 17th. Here we have 1300. Right, those numbers are useless to us because they're too early in the day. 1300 the day before. No, that's the one that we were just looking at. So the day before that, 1200. The day before that, 1100. The day before that, 1000. And the day before that, 1100 again. So we were in the rough 1000 to 1100 range for a while. We had 1500. No, that's the 17th. So theoretically, that should be hiding way back over here. There we go. So we've been ramping up in the number of new cases that we have each day. We've just been slowing down in the speed with which those cases are ramping up. Now that could, and hopefully is, due to the flattening of the curve that we talk about. That could just as easily be due to the restrictions that we have in our testing supply. So we need to be aware of both of those options, especially now that we see the death toll ramping up significantly within the last few days. To give an idea of that, this is back April 11th. April 11th, Canada had 653 deaths. That's including the 84 that we had in that 24 hours. If we hop back to today, current now numbers, Canada is now sitting at 1310. We are now on these would be the beginning of the 18th numbers. So in a 7-day period, we have more than doubled our overall deaths. It took from January 20th to get to this number. And we just went in a 7-day period up to this number. If that continues, we could start looking like the UK rather quickly, because 2 weeks ago, the UK looked exactly like what we do right now. Now, I'm not saying we're going to follow that path exactly, but I would like to point out that the measures that we're taking as a public are surprisingly similar to the measures that the UK has taken thus far. In fact, the UK is in a much heavier lockdown position than we are, and started that heavier lockdown position slightly earlier than we, earlier in the curve of their curve than we are in our curve now. I don't know if that made perfect sense, but hopefully it did. Okay, before we start getting into a little bit more of the wayback machine stuff, so that would be dealing with the kind of original outbreak, and just looking briefly at some of the original things that happened throughout the period between the beginnings of this particular Worldometer site and the beginning of the Italy outbreak. Before we do so, I would like to point out that the test per 1 million population, the higher this number, the more weight we can give to the data that it's showing. So if they've tested 2% of their population and found this number of cases, that can be weighed a little more heavily than, say, Brazil, who has tested 0.02 of their population and found this many. Now, where this worries me the most is when we get into India, which has an absolutely gigantic population and is starting to show a ramp up in cases and deaths. If we go to India, India had 38 deaths today, with only 922 new cases, but is only testing 0.02 of their population right now. When you have 1.3 billion people living in a relatively small area, that is the ideal spread situation for a virus like this. And the more spread we have, the more chance that there is for mutation. Now, luckily, the coronavirus family does not seem to be a very highly mutative family from what I understand, and this particular virus seems to be reasonably stable. That's kind of a double-edged sword. We don't have to worry too much about it mutating too heavily, but if it becomes an endemic virus, it does mean that it could retain this level of case fatality rate for a long period of time. And if, as we discussed, we have low antibody numbers and low immunity presented because of that low antibody load, then this could be a very serious recurrent disease. Okay, so let's take an adventure in the Wayback Machine. These, again, are yesterday's current or full numbers, so technically yesterday, so the 17th. I guess at this point this will be posted on the 18th. So yeah, yesterday's full numbers. Today's current numbers look somewhat like this. Pretty much exactly like what we just saw. Now, I have mentioned in a previous video, any one of the countries that has a link on its name has its own page as well, which gives us its own logarithmic charts. So see, this is where we see the flattening of the curve that we hear about quite often in the news here in Canada. I would like to point out that we're not getting as much flattening. We possibly are getting some flattening, but this still looks like a pretty straight line to me on the death side of things. Now, as I mentioned before, because of the sporadic nature of testing, which might be the most diplomatic way of putting it I can think of right now, we should probably trust the trend curves of total deaths more than we should trust the trend curves of total cases. However, I will also point out that deaths lag behind cases by probably an average of about 2 weeks. That's actually something worth mentioning. So let's just go back over here. The numbers that we are seeing here in new cases is not a reflection of what's happening right now. Because there's a delayed incubation period. So cases that we see happening right now in a 24-hour period were actually infected likely 2 weeks ago. That 5 to 14-day window we hear about, well, the window should probably be closer to 5 to 21 days because we do have multiple documented cases of 21 days. We also have anecdotal cases of up to 27 days between the time of actual infection and first symptoms emerging. So if we're only testing people who have symptoms that have already emerged, then the likelihood is it's probably been up to 2 weeks. We could take an average of, let's say, 10 days, 9.5, 10 days would be between the 5 and 14. If we want to stretch the 5 and 21, then we can look a little closer at the 14-day level. But that would be our average point for when these people were actually infected. So any infections that happen literally today would not show up in this column for an average of 2 weeks from now. The deaths are an even further delay because this is the point that they get sick enough to get tested. They then have to spend some time in hospital, and if they get onto a ventilator, the average time on ventilator right now is between a week and 2 weeks, although 3 weeks is not unheard of at all. So if we take just an average of, say, a week, we've got 10 days over here. We add on another 7 days. We can round this off together to be about 3 weeks afterwards, after infection, that we get people into this column if they're going to end up here. So neither of these columns are an image of what's happening right now. This is an image of what happened 2 weeks ago. This is an image of what happened 3+ weeks ago, 3 to 4 weeks ago. Okay, so let's take a quick look at the states, because this is a little worrisome that New York is continuing to ramp up. New York, I did check in. New York City has about 250,000 cases on its own right now, and that only works out to about 0.6% of the New York population. So considerably far away from anything approaching herd immunity. Now, granted, that 250,000 cases is a massively low underestimate because it's not going to include any of the people who haven't been tested yet. But even if we ramp that up by a factor of 10, a factor of 20, factor of 10 brings us to 6%, 20 would be 12%. We're still way short of herd immunity. We would have to be looking at a factor of 100 to get up to the 60% area. And while that's not impossible, it doesn't seem highly likely, and it's perhaps not something we should be pinning our hopes on until we have better testing saturation, especially from antibody testing, so we can find the people who have already gone through the disease progression. Okay, Wayback Machine. We talked already about how it works. This is the very first image, so way back on the 29th. Now, take a good look at what today looks like. 29th of January looked like this. All cases of note in China, all deaths in China anyways. It is worth noting that even way back on January 29th, the United States had cases, Canada had cases. The ones that we don't see here are the United Kingdom, not yet, Iran, not yet, Italy, not yet, Germany, yes, France, yes. These are pretty much exclusively imported cases. Well, they're obviously imported cases. It's possible there might be a little bit of community spread in some of the Asian nations that got the spread over from China quickest. But again, keep in mind that most of these nations have a lot of experience with respiratory disease and infectious diseases, so a lot of these nations would have taken steps very quickly to get into that containment phase and tracking of contacts. Something that was definitely done here in North America, but might not have been done to the level it could have been. Yeah. It's unfortunate. There's a lot of things that could have been done differently, but we're going to just look at what's happened along the way so that we can look at where we're going from here. We can go back and do some complaining about the past once we get past all this. So we'll hop over just one more day, just to show the speed with that things were ramping up in Wuhan. That's another 2,000 cases found, and the deaths had jumped considerably in a one-day period. So it was already well into the pandemic, the epidemic in Wuhan, when Worldometer started tracking these things. It also took a while before we started getting logarithmic graphs available. Okay, so February 2nd, I believe, is the first death outside of China. So that happened in the Philippines. At this point, Canada's still at 4 cases. The US has moved up to 8. Italy and the UK have joined the board. India has joined the board. So has Russia, actually. Now, again, almost exclusively imported cases. A lot of these would have been caught at the border, and contact tracing and containment measurements would have held up for quite a while. Okay, we're going to hop over to the 5th. That's when we start getting the linear versus logarithmic graphs available. Just for you math geeks out there who find this stuff interesting. We also start getting more and more data. You'll find as we go on, the spreadsheet gets larger with different options. February 10th is when we start getting a closed case ratio. It hasn't been built together yet, but we start getting more and more information here. So you can see why I preferred this site over John Hopkins. Okay, we're over to February 12th. Now, it is worth noting that when we started getting the close case outcomes, it started at 20%, but as we discussed, this was early in the Wuhan outbreak. In fact, only half of the cases that would eventually get detected have been detected, and less than a third of the deaths that would eventually happen had happened at this point. So we had the bulk of the cases still in the active category, because the recoveries were very low, the deaths were relatively low. So this is an early point in that chain of events from the active side of things through either recovered or dead, unfortunately. So by the next day, it had already dropped down to 19, or 2 days later, sorry. Already dropped down to 19%, and this will continue dropping down until such time around the 7th to 9th of March that both Iran and Italy really start kicking in, and that starts driving it back up again. Is there anything else about the 12th that was of interest? We started getting a little more data down here. This is back when the WHO was estimating 2%. We're still working from a estimate of 3.4% from the WHO, which I honestly hope is high. 3.4% is a massive amount of people. We can take Ottawa's population as an example there. We've got 1 million people in Ottawa, so 1% of Ottawa's population ends up bringing us over to, 10,000? 3.4, that would be 34,000 people dying in Ottawa alone. Now, granted, it wouldn't be 100% of the population that would be infected, but 80% of the population. Okay, so we're at 800,000 now, and we're going to take 1% of that. That's 8,000, bringing that up to 3.4, and it's equally bad. Anywho, I'm ranting a little, aren't I? February 18th. We've now dropped down to 12%, so this will continue dropping. I believe the bottoming out point ends up being 6%. Now, had Italy and Iran not started ramping up right then, it's pretty much guaranteed that it would drop below 6%, or definitely gotta hope, and hopefully would drop down well below the 3.4% that the WHO is estimating. Once we finally end up managing to count all the people that have been infected, then we might be able to get a real handle on it and drive it even lower than that. But until then, 1% is the happy medium that my brain likes to deal with. Anything higher than that gets really scary. Anything lower than that, I still deem to be a little bit too hopeful until better data comes out. The other thing I want to talk about in the 18th here is the Diamond Princess. This is a really interesting case in the sense that its data got added onto Worldometers. It's a kind of contained incident, so we know how many people were on the ship, we know how many people tested positive, and we have been able to track the outcomes of all those people. So it's a very interesting case study in that respect, but I'm not going to get into that part of it. What I am going to get into, just for a second, we're going to jump back to current data right now. We are going to refresh just to show that this is current data right now, so we're 2.25 million worldwide. I'm going to scroll down a ways, because 700 is pretty low compared to most countries these days, unfortunately. But over at 712, we will find the Diamond Princess. What I'd like to point out is under active cases, 55 of those 712 are still active. We were just looking at the Diamond Princess on February 18th. It is now April 18th. And we still have 55 cases that are active, with 7 of them being serious or critical. I would also like to point out that I think it was 4 days ago that this was still at 10. So the ratio between these is getting worse and worse as these remaining cases filter their way through. But these are people who have been actively fighting the virus for 2 months now, some of whom have been in very serious condition for an extended period of time. These are people who have been on ventilators in some cases for over a month, possibly longer. So something to think about before writing this virus off as not something all that scary that is going to be a mild case that everyone's going to get over. Okay, so that was February 18th. 19th, we're still at 12. I'm sure there's a reason I have the 19th up. Iran, yes, that's the reason. That Iran shows up with 2 cases, first 2 cases total, which are also its first 2 deaths. So the way that Iran found out that they had a COVID-19 outbreak is through the deaths. If we're looking at a 1% case fatality rate, then that would indicate that there's probably another 198 cases in the greater population at this point. If we're looking at a 3%, then it's less than that, obviously. But it does indicate that there was community spread before it was noticed in the population. You'll notice Italy at the moment has 3. We're going to hop ahead 2 days only. Italy got caught off guard in much the same way that Iran did. So Iran at this point is putting on 3 a day, but already is putting on another 2 deaths. This is only 2 days later. Italy has gone from 3 to 21, 17 of which was found in 1 day, and we now have a death in Italy. The reason I brought up the 21st originally is not to illustrate that what happens when a country kind of gets caught off guard with community spread before they're able to really get lockdown measures in place. But we're gonna take a quick look at that in 1 second. The main reason I pulled that up originally is because, not the one I wanted, but that's also discouraging, is because the way that the lockdown worked in Italy, finally on March 9th, the whole country locked down. That was their national quarantine. But the very first lockdowns happened in 11 municipalities up in the Lombardy province, and that was on February 21st. So that was when they realized that they had an outbreak up there. So they had 21 cases with 1 death, and that's when the initial lockdown started. What happened after that, the lockdown of those 11 regions was expanded to the entire Lombardy province. That happened on the 8th. However, the word got out that that was going to happen on the 7th. Maybe it was the 6th. There was at least 24 hours before the actual lockdown happened when newspapers were reporting that the lockdown was going to happen. So a lot of people left the Lombardy region in the north and spread outwards towards the south to try to avoid being stuck in lockdown. Many of them likely had some mild symptoms or were asymptomatic carriers, and the government must have feared that because on the 9th, as we discussed, they went through and locked down the entire country. The reason that they were willing to do that on the 9th is we're starting back on the 21st with 21. 17 happened that day, 1 death that day. We hop about a week later, and Italy's suddenly got 2,000 total cases with 52 total deaths. 11 of them had happened that day. These type growth patterns is what caused the government to be ready to do a full lockdown. So that happened on March 9th. And at that point, they had 9,000 cases countrywide. We're putting on 1,700, almost 1,800 cases a day, and we're having 100 deaths. I bring this up because there's certain similarities, unfortunately, with the point that we're at in Canada. Just Canada has a considerable higher number. This again is back on the 17th, so actually 16th because we're looking at yesterday data. Yeah, this would have been just before the reset, so it would have been the 16th. Putting on 1,500 a day, and in this case we had close to 200, but if we look at our current data, so yesterday, so the 17th data, looks surprisingly similar. 1,800, roughly 100. We are not in the level of state of lockdown that Italy went into. However, unlike Italy, we have had social distancing, closure of schools, closure of non-essential businesses. We have definitely taken the path down to lockdown. So from a national level, we're doing relatively good. Let me get back to where we were. What we aren't doing is doing the lockdown way back at this point. We have allowed a lot more community spread to spread outwards. This is Ottawa on Friday. Cases jumped by 50 with 7 new deaths just for Ottawa itself. So we are starting in on a boom phase here. We have had community spread for a considerable amount of time now, known for at least 2.5 weeks, I believe, suspected for closer to 3, almost a month. I would have to go back through some of the stories that I've linked on the Discord channel and check that, because I know I did link some of those. So yeah, March 9th. What happened then is a kind of interesting thing to see. So if we go back to the 21st, we're at 21, that's the lockdown of the northern provinces. Northern provinces continue to expand their numbers. So that's about a week later. About 2 weeks later is where we get the lockdown of the entire country. Numbers are continuing to ramp up, but are still relatively manageable. About a week after that, we're now up at 3,000 to 3,500 roughly cases per day. Still under 200 deaths per day, but definitely ramping upwards. At this point, they finally had 1,400 deaths, which is not all that far off from where we are right now. Again, I don't expect us to follow the same curve, but I do expect us to ramp up considerably from where we are, and we need to be aware and expecting that, not thinking that we've dodged a bullet here. 3,500 for Italy again. This is only a few days later. I'm not sure why I grabbed the 17th. Oh yes, because the 17th is the actual span of a week. The reason I'd grab the 14th is that's the day of the Spanish lockdown, at which point they had 6,000 cases. We're going up by over 1,000 per, and had a national death toll of 200. So again, Spanish lockdown, considerably heavier lockdown than anything we've tried in North America. So the 17th is roughly our week jump. And Italy's now, again, the 3,500, and we're up to, we've taken a jump already. We're up to about 350 deaths per day. Let's jump ahead another week. Getting close to 5,000 new cases per day. This is when the US started really doing their testing, and started getting onto the board as far as new deaths go, in a kind of similar area to where Canada is now. This is March 23rd, so about 3 weeks ago, 3.5 weeks ago, something like that. So at this point, total deaths had made their way up to 6,000 in Italy, and have still not reached their peak. So for those counting, that's a month since the lockdown of the north. Still going up. 812, this is the week that they're going to peak. Or that they did peak. Remember, this is all in the past. So Italy at that point has already started to reduce its new case count. That's important, in that the new case count will start to go down before the deaths start to go down. Remember, here in Canada, we are still quite drastically going up in our cases. Well, not quite drastically, sorry. Let me rephrase that. We are most definitely going up. We have slowed the rate of that going up, but yes, again, that one's really annoying me, so we're just going to get rid of that because that was a picture taken in the middle of the day. 1,500, and the day before had been 1,300. And we're now up to 1,800. That was yesterday's. So yeah, and today we have nothing yet. But we are definitely still going up in our new cases, so we will definitely still go up in our new deaths. What happened in Italy, so over here, is we start to get the drop in the new cases coming in. The deaths are still going up. They, in the case of Italy anyways, will peak around this area. I think I just kept jumping weeks because we don't need to keep being depressed by seeing those numbers. So yes, Italy at this point has dropped down past Spain, or below Spain. The US has jumped way up, we'll talk about them some other time. There's a whole bunch of stuff that's going to go wrong in the U.S., and pay-to-play healthcare is one of them, which is unfortunately really going to kill a lot of people. Yeah. So, Italy, at this point, this is April 6th, so if the full lockdown of the country was almost at the 1 month point, when the tides finally started to go down somewhat. It's important to note that Italy is still retaining deaths in the 500 to 600 per day. This is a plateau that they're in. That's what the lockdown creates. It will eventually fizzle out completely if the lockdown stays secure enough. But anytime there's breaks in the lockdown and new chains start up, then we get to that kind of plateau phase. And that's what flattening the curve means, that instead of getting thousands upon thousands of deaths every day, we're trying to get hundreds of deaths every day. Now, the part that doesn't always come across clearly in that explanation is, instead of having thousands and thousands per day for a short period, like a month or two, we are working to have hundreds per day over a much longer period, like a year or two. So in order to maintain those lower death rates, we will have to do this over a much longer period of time. The reason that we do so is because that keeps our health system intact and able to deal with the speed of things, and still have a little bit of extra room for all the normal problems that they deal with in a year. Because they can't just become COVID hospitals. People will still get born, people will still break bones, people will still have appendicitis, people will still have cancer, people will still need dialysis. All of these things are going to continue to happen. We just now have COVID on top of all of that. So we need to try to keep it in some sort of check so that it doesn't completely just overrun the system, break down the system, and then we start getting additional deaths from all of the other things that the system normally stops. Okay, I could probably rant for a lot longer, and I probably shouldn't, especially since it's starting to get quite late and I've been talking for a long time. Canada is in a better position than it could have been. It's in a worse position than it could have been. We have not dodged any sort of bullet, and I do think the next 7 days are going to make that kind of plain to us. We have, however, done some incredible things and have managed to flatten out some of the mess that was heading our way. So we can be optimistic in the sense that we now know that the public, when on board, can get this somewhat under control. We can retain our sanity and still do some of these crazy things that are driving some of us insane. The question now becomes, how long can we do it for? Because the window of time that we're going to have to do this is a lot longer than we're really accepting right now. And it's going to do some absolutely horrible things to our economy, to our society. These are not things that should be taken lightly, and I will do an additional video looking at the ripple effects of the economy. The problem becomes that, like we've discussed in previous parts of this is a health issue first and an economic issue second. We can't restart the economy without dealing with the health hazard first, or we're going to end up doing this crazy yo-yo game. And we all know that the stock market and the economy in the Western world, and by virtue of that, the rest of the globe pretty much, is based less on actual actual physical goods than it is on the moods of investors at any given time. We know that small events can have gigantic ripple effects because people start noticing other people buying and or selling a particular stock and just pile on. It's not a rational market that we have in the West. And hasn't been for a very long time. So that's something that I will discuss a little further. I want to have a lot more information up in front of me so that I can point you guys to places to really take a solid look at this. But it is worth noting that regardless of what stocks are doing right now, oil is not doing the same thing. One is a physical asset, one is a paper asset. And I would invite you guys to look much more seriously at physical assets, especially as they surround energy, as they surround food, as they surround pretty much anything that we need on the survival side of things, because there has been a lot of rumblings about the food supply. There's been a lot of rumblings about the meat supply, but also the produce supply. I know a lot of you guys did not take me seriously a month ago when I said that these things would start to become a problem, but they are most definitely going to start to become a problem, and we have to start to address that. Long-term plans have to be made now, even if they never have to be used. But if they do have to be used, we won't have time to make those plans later. So gardens, those of you who know me well enough to ask, I will have extra plants. Those of you who don't know me well enough to ask, send an email. I've been leaving an email address for this channel down in the description. I will see what I can do. But those of you who don't know offhand, most vegetables and fruits that we buy in the store, we can grow the seeds from. Apparently, if they've crossed a border, especially come up from Mexico, they may be irradiated, so the seeds might not ever germinate, but there's all kinds of fun ways of testing that, and a lot of them just include a wet paper towel and a Ziploc bag and a fridge and a window. Go on YouTube, all kinds of people will teach you how. So start some of these things, because we should hedge what bets we can now. Inflation is going to be coming in our future. Anyone who's seen the amount of money printed in both the US and Canada in the last few weeks knows that. A lot of unemployment is coming in the future. We might be able to mitigate some of that. Masks for everyone is going to be part of that mitigation, so we need to all get on that. If anyone hasn't made themselves masks yet, please start making yourself masks, or get someone to make some masks for you. Again, anyone who knows me close enough, send me an email, a text, or whatever. I will see what I can get out. I'm making some for my wife's work first, and for my brother and his family. I do want to send some out to them. But I will happily get you on the list, and my wife's starting to play with the sewing machine too, so we might be able to double our production. Maybe I'll be able to get out a few more videos. I will be making some more in the future. Like I said, I'm going to do an economy one. I'm also going to do one addressing some of the conspiracy theories that are going around. It's not going to be debunking all of them. It's not going to be praising all of them. It's going to be looking at some of them rather seriously, because I think some of them do rather seriously exist. I don't think that they're necessarily the ones that are getting the most headlines or screen lines on YouTube and other social media areas right now. But I do think that they're worth discussing, and I do think that it's most definitely worth the public keeping an eye out, because a lot of the steps that we are going to have to take to deal with this pandemic situation are steps that give a lot of power to the government, hopefully for a very short temporary period of time. But it will definitely behoove us as a population to keep an eye on those levers of power, because as we all know, absolute power does tend to corrupt absolutely, and we may have to give some of our politicians some powers that are pretty damn close to absolute for short periods of time. So we've got to keep an eye on that. And what is going on in Turkey? I will have to look into that. But yeah, this is a global problem, guys. Even if we do dodge this bullet, let's imagine everything goes away in Canada right now. Unless it goes away everywhere else, then it's still a problem that we're going to have to address. And this is definitely a problem that we're going to have to address. Okay, guys, I'm leaving it here. I will come back with some more stuff later. If you've listened this far, thank you very much. It's unlikely that any of you have, but if you have, leave me a comment or something. It would be great to know. Thanks, guys. Take care of yourselves. I will talk to you soon. Plant a garden, make a mask, be nice to one another. Things are going to continue getting worse before they get better, and the stress levels are going to get really high. But yeah, thanks for listening. Take care, and I'll talk to you soon.